Hello, fellow Smashers. I'm Quality Mojo, and I'm back to this channel to talk a bit about the history of Swarm in Smash Up. Swarm is an interesting archetype. I've seen it considered as oppressive or even downright broken, and there are a lot of posts on Reddit or Facebook asking for help on how to handle Swarm decks. So much so that fellow members of the Smash Up Cabal even created decks designed specifically to counter Swarm factions. So I figured, why not talk a bit about Swarm from a design perspective? How did Smash Up design these factions up until now? First of all, we have to ask ourselves, what is a Swarm faction? What makes a Swarm faction? I would define a Swarm faction by its game plan. A Swarm faction game plan is to win bases by putting a high number of minions into play in a short amount of time with close to no setup, and to be able to do it repeatedly. From a deck design perspective, Swarm factions have three characteristics: high amount of extra minions, card draw to fuel these extra plays, and, most of the time, recursion to smooth out their mid to late game when they are prone to minion starvation. A few examples of Swarm factions would be robots, halflings, rockstars, penguins, Beauty and the Beasts, or skeletons. Some factions have some of the three characteristics I mentioned earlier, but their game plan is different enough to be called Swarm factions. For instance, mages have a high amount of extra plays, and card draw to fuel these extra plays, but no recursion, and their game plan doesn't solely rely on spamming minions to win bases. Another famous example of a faction who looks like a Swarm faction, but might not be one, is Teddy Bears. They have high amount of extra plays, card draw, and even cards that go well with Swarm style plays. But they have no recursion, and have more of an area control game plan, with cards like Fun Bear or Bear Picnic. These factions who tend towards swarming but are not really swarm factions are what we call swarm supports. Other examples of swarm supports are magical girls, killer plants, or star roamers. Now that we know what a swarm faction is, let's talk about how they evolved during the history of Smash Up and why this archetype feels sometimes so broken. Let's start with the OG Swarm deck, Robots. Robots, of course, check all characteristics of a Swarm deck. High amount of extra plays, card draw, recursion. I think what pushes robots over the edge is efficiency. Their capacity to break bases, with close to no setup, is still unmatched. And it is because of two reasons. They have high density of minions, which bring them consistency, and they also have another trick. Namely, they have two instances of +1 power for each minion on a base. I will call this effect an anthem effect. If you understand the reference, please leave a comment below. They also got the infamous Microbot Alpha, who gets bigger the more its bases is crowded. And we will see that this idea of efficiency by buffing all minions on a base will be a staple in the Swarm context. Another OG faction is zombies. Of course, they are the masters of recursion and they have high amount of extra plays. But they don't have that much card draw, although they have deck shifting tied to their capacity to play from the discard pile. Some of their cards were also used as a template for other Swarm factions. Lend a hand, for instance, and not enough bullets will both be reused, sometimes in a nerfed way and sometimes in a better way, by more recent Swarm factions. After these two factions, the history of Swarm became somewhat complicated. Awesome level 9000 didn't bring any Swarm factions. The Cthulhu set brought out Innsmouth. While this faction checked the boxes for a good Swarm faction, it initially lacked the punch robots bring to the table. It was viewed as a bad faction. They got an anthem effect in the form of the deep ones but they weren't efficient enough nor fast enough to compete. After that, the Swarm archetype disappeared, for it to be back 3 sets later, in Pretty Pretty. Mythic Horses is an interesting case of a Swarm faction. They still have extra plays, card draw, and anthem effects, but no recursion whatsoever. I would assume they were trying to balance the strength of the faction by giving them higher power outputs, but no way to get back their minions. They also give Swarm new tools in the form of movement, and it will also become a staple for later Swarm decks. After Horses, Smash Up entered the era of what I would call modern Swarm. They understood how to create Swarm decks who don't feel too broken, but don't feel weak either. Let's take a look. Halflings, for instance, are elegant despite being vanilla. They lack efficiency because they have no anthem effect, but they compensate with higher draw power. They have no tools other than their extra plays and recursion, but they still work. I feel like they are the balanced version of robots. Rockstars, on the other hand, have all the tools I described: extra plays, recursion, card draw, anthem effect, movement, you name it. Let's talk about Shield. Extra plays, recursion, card draw, anthem effect, and movement. Beauty and the Beast don't bring movement to the table, but they have other tools to compensate. Penguins, Hydra, Frozen, Skeletons, while being very different factions on the surface, follow the same core idea of what a Swarm faction should be. And I don't feel any of these factions feel too broken. Rockstar might be at the limit of what is acceptable, they are consistent, and they are really effective at what they do. But I've never felt overwhelmed by them. Now that we know the design philosophy behind Swarm factions, I ought to ask, what next? I feel like there's still a lot of space design when it comes to Swarm factions. Because their core philosophy is so simple, it's so easy to mix them up with other concepts. For instance, the Hibernators factions for Icebread was an interesting take on Swarm, using hand size to enable their abilities. What do you feel about Swarm decks? Do you think they are too powerful? How do you think the next Swarm faction will look like? Let us know in the comments. Thanks to Jim for inviting me to his channel, and thank you for watching. You can join me on the French Discord server if you want to play a few games of Smash Up. See you next time, guys. Let's shut it down.